All right, welcome to A Frisch Perspective Live. We have people already, I see, joining us here. Let us know in the comments if you're here, where you're watching from, or just say hi. We just love to know that people are out there and interacting with us. We're going to be talking about a Bible translation tonight, which I know a lot of people in my audience are really interested in Bible translation, that subject, because I've covered it quite a bit on my channel. And I have a special guest with me tonight who I actually came to be connected with because of the translation we're talking about tonight, which is the Modern English Version. Now, my guest tonight, Marcus Moreno, is not a Bible translator, but he is a English teacher, high school English teacher, and he is familiar with different Bible translations and is very interested in the subject himself. I think is kind of a champion of the modern English version in certain ways, which we'll talk about tonight. But also, he is a moderator, comment moderator for Mark Ward's channel. So I'll put a plug in now for Mark Ward's channel. If you're not aware of his channel, he has a great channel on YouTube talking about Bible translation, particularly talking a lot about the King James Version versus modern translations and why we need modern translations. And that's certainly going to be part of what we're talking about tonight, because the modern English version is a translation that uses the Textus Receptus as the textual basis for the New Testament. So it really overlaps with the King James Version in that way. And people that like the Textus Receptus and trust the Textus Receptus, a lot of times they say, well, I can't read a modern translation because it doesn't use the Textus Receptus, but the modern English version does use the Textus Receptus. So that is one of the reasons that it's really a relevant translation when it comes to the issue of King James readers and people that maybe have a hard time with the idea of reading a modern translation. So we'll talk about that tonight, but I want to welcome my guest now, Marcus Moreno. It is great to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
And you're an English teacher, I got that right, for high school students.
Yes.
And so how long have you been teaching?
At the high school level, this is, I'm in year 6, I think.
Okay. And is it a Christian school setting or a public school setting?
No, it's public school.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, you were telling me before we went on, though, that you do actually teach some Bible-related stuff.
Oh, yeah, it's an academic Bible class. It's allowed under the, it's one of the courses that's allowed by the state, so as an elective.
That's great. Wow. Well, I'll tell you, when I think of public school in America, I don't usually think of the Bible as really an opportunity to be taught there, but there are exceptions, as you're saying, where certain courses, from a certain angle, a certain approach, you can actually teach about the Bible.
Right. Well, if anyone has ever tried to teach American or British literature, you'll discover that if the kids are not literate in the Bible, it doesn't matter whether or not it's a religious literacy or not. They're not going to understand a huge chunk of American and British literature. It's so heavily based on the Tyndale King James tradition and constantly making reference to it, no matter what the religious beliefs are of the people who are doing the writing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I'm glad that you're an English teacher, because one of the things that what we really want to talk about tonight is English.
Right.
We forget sometimes, right, that translation is English. And we're going to talk about the King James some. You were just showing me you have a King James Bible. Don't you have it there, a King James
Okay.
Bible?
Yes, my props for this. First of all, unfortunately, I don't have the fancy, expensive facsimile of the 1611, but I do have Zondervan's rather cheap one that unfortunately leaves out the Apocrypha, but contains most of the other front material and all the original text and the original Gothic font and everything. And then for my more casual reading, when I'm not feeling like reading S's that look like F's and things like that, is the New Cambridge Paragraph Bible with the Apocrypha by David Morton. in 2005.
All right. Your sound there sounded like it got muffled a little bit, but I hope that's just a temporary thing. But someone in the comments, and I'll just put that up here, said the Bible is foundational to the entire English language. And the King James version definitely is part of that heritage for sure. When we think about the English and even certain phrases that we use, we could definitely think back to the King James. But as you pointed out, the King James version uh, is not static in its history. The early edition that you showed there is actually different than the one people today use.
Right. Some ways, even in the translation, definitely in spelling and formatting. Uh, I actually find that even though the black letter text, this older font can be rather difficult to read, uh, because the original edition used smaller Roman type for the supplied words rather than italics. I actually find it easy to read in that way because the supplied words aren't shouting out at me as a italic font. They're smaller, they're de-emphasized rather than overemphasized as in the modern formatting.
Yeah, and the original was also pretty large, right?
Right. Yeah.
Quite a large pages by compared to what we're used to. So those words in the Bible text would have been fairly large font, whereas the supplied words would be considerably smaller than the regular Bible text.
Right. Still big enough that you can read it without any issues. It doesn't break up the text to the point that it would throw you off. But yeah, definitely drawing emphasis to the words that are meant to be direct glosses of the Hebrew and Greek words rather than emphasizing the words they're providing for clarity.
And I mentioned this to you one other time when we talked, but I have an old edition of the Holman Christian Standard, and in the first iteration of it, they use little corner brackets for supplied words, which kind of does more what you're talking about with the original King James. It kind of de-emphasizes those supplied words. They're still there, they're still helpful, but it kind of lets you know this translator supplied those, but it's not adding a lot of attention to them, which I think is really good. I wish I could show it better on camera because I can see an example here, but it just doesn't come through on camera well.
Right. I've seen that the early editions of the Holman Christian Standard Bible, and I did think that that was far less intrusive than the italic font.
Yeah.
Maybe if you can convince a few publishers to go that way whenever they're coming,
Yeah.
especially when we're coming up with these fancy new fonts, comfort print and something, how about a comfort print with corner brackets, right?
Yeah. Well, speaking of recommending for publishers, we're going to talk tonight about what we would recommend if we were the publisher of the modern English version. And for those of you in the comments, we'd love to see your thoughts on this too, because it's very likely that people who are involved with the modern English version project will watch this video, and it's always helpful for them to have feedback. And I mentioned that Marcus and I were connected because of the modern English version. And actually, James Lindsay, the editor for that translation, was the one who put us in contact with each other and thought it might be great if we had a conversation. So I'd like to thank James Lindsay for recommending this conversation. And I think Marcus was kind of a little surprised. He wasn't necessarily expecting to be asked to do something like this. But you do like the modern English version, I think, from what we've talked about. You've been on the Facebook page maybe and
Right.
talked about it there.
Yeah. So when I was hearing that the rumored, the legendary second edition was actually getting some traction over at Charisma House, the publisher, I wanted to check in on how things were going. And so I went there and then I began commenting on certain translation decisions, both positive and less positive, trying to offer constructive feedback on certain choices. But I was then sort of asked to be part of a group that was submitting suggestions to the committee. Uh, And then even after we sort of wrap that up, I still continue making certain suggestions, just on the Facebook page. And I guess the editor of the translation either decided that maybe he should redirect my positive and negative comments elsewhere, or he just thought that I seemed to know about it well enough to talk about it.
Maybe both. I
Right.
think what I've learned about you, and I've kind of seen this in comments that you've made on my channel and others, that you tell people straight up what you think, and that's a really good thing. It gives people honest feedback, and I think you've tried to supply that for the modern English version. That being said, there's a disclaimer here. Not everything Marcus has recommended has necessarily been implemented. Am I right on that?
Right. Yeah. It's not as if I was officially taken on as a stylist or something like
Right.
that.
Yeah.
Maybe
So,
some of
so you
my
don't
gripes
have,
have gotten through.
yeah, you don't have like final say on these things. So people that are talking to us tonight, we need to set the expectation that we're just voices out there giving feedback to the publisher. It's ultimately the publisher's decision, and the team that is editing the modern English version that decides how the final product is going to actually look and be presented. But certainly the editor, James Lindsay, I think I can tell he wants feedback. He desires that, and he wants people to know that they're trying to listen. That being said, I mean, I think it's a good time to start getting into this. If we were the publisher for this Bible translation, what would we do? And one thing I will say is there has been so much interest in this translation. It's kind of a shame that not more is being communicated on a regular basis about where things are at. Now, I have heard people talk about, oh yeah, they're coming out, but I feel like it feels like people are left out a little in the dark by and large. And the publisher, I know it's hard. They're probably juggling some things, but I think they really they have an opportunity to be able to say to people, yes, the second edition is coming. Here is the timeline that we're really looking at that's feasible for it, and here is what we think are going to be the features of the second edition. I haven't really heard that directly from the publisher, other than when someone says, oh, I talked to them and they said that, but never have I seen a press release.
So what I have seen on the Facebook group is someone from the company or someone else from the company making a statement. And, that's helpful for like the loyalists who are there wanting to hang out and actually discuss it day after day. But for the broader populace, they kind of need to know that this is happening. It's been talked about for years and years. One of the big problems that people have had with the modern English version is that it contained a few typos, and people kept waiting for it to be changed and waiting for it to be changed, to fix these minor things that people had pointed out. And I think a big part of the problem was they had a big stock of unsold ones that they were hoping to clear out so that they could justify making the changes. But what ended up happening is a lot of people have lost confidence in it. And what they need to do now is build that confidence back. Hey, we are still here. We are still trying to be a relevant, notable translation of the Bible. It's one of those things where, you're always in that danger of becoming an also-ran if you don't get things out often enough. And I don't just mean editions out. I mean, just get news out. Another translation I think of that kind of suffers from this is the Common English Bible, where it's like, oh yeah, that one exists, and it's kind of sad to say, like, I think there are issues with that one. I think there are merits to it, but people have to talk about it. You can't just let it be forgotten.
Yeah, and especially when you're talking about a translation that really does have such a unfilled niche in so many ways. I mean, the modern translations, a lot of them are similar in so many ways, whereas the modern English version has this feature about it the Textus Receptus for the New Testament being what I would say is a key feature that really gives it a unique place in the market, a great opportunity. And if they were to highlight that and really run with that and say, this is the most accessible, understandable, modern way of conveying the biblical text in our language, but with the Textus Receptus in the New Testament. I mean, I think there's just such an avid market for that out there. Even for people that don't use the Textus Receptus primarily, they still want to have something on their shelf for reference.
Right. So if you actually look at Bibles that you can regularly find, right, not some sort of obscure third millennium Bible or KJV 2028 or whatever someone has released, that a single person putting out their own edition and calling it a new Textus Receptus translation, that of the ones that actually are like committee-based translations, your options are the King James, the New King James, and the Modern English Version. And so that is a major marketing point that, this really is your only other serious option. I mean, you can try to go with something like Barber's Simplified King James Version or the King James ER and things like that, but those aren't done by a committee that actually is looking at it from an academic scholarly perspective. Not to bash the Simplified King James Version, it's a very nice edition, but it was done by sort of a group of editors from a company that is just looking over and just trying to update the language with no interest in the scholarly side of it, in the academic side of it. And so the MEV has that going for it.
Yeah. So when they do come out with the second edition, and we're assuming they're going to, it sounds like there is still that idea in the works. It hasn't fallen by the wayside totally, not as quickly as people want. But what editions might be good if we were the publisher? I know that, and when I say that, I mean like, what kind of style are we looking for as people that are likely to put it on our shelf? So, for example, there are different formats that people want, and I think one really good format, just to give an example, would be some sort of a reference Bible, and I think they've done that before. But really taking a look at what is it people today, are finding to be the most useful, and just something that really is usable, and just as pleasant to use, because old style reference Bibles, one of the problems would be, you'd just have so much on the page and the paper would be really thin. So making sure that you have a reference Bible, that the references are clean, easy to find, good cross references, and the text is nice and readable, legible, and the paper doesn't have a lot of ghosting. Those are just some things that I would think. I don't know if you have any other ideas for editions that they might want to consider having.
Wait, are you saying that we shouldn't go back to like the study Bibles of the late 1800s, early 1900s, where they're just nigh unreadable blocks of text and lines that are nearly indecipherable?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, and I think there's subtle things you can do now, and they have other publishers to look at, to compare with, and say, okay, what's out there, and they can kind of mimic some of the features that are best practices right now in the publishing world, such as line matching, which they may have done on the first edition anyway. But if they didn't do that, and now that I think about it, I'm not sure they did line matching. So making sure they do line matching for the text.
You have one right behind you, don't you?
I do. I could take that off the shelf and double check, but I seem to remember that it was not line matched.
Yeah. Well, as you're pulling it out, could you hold up the cover for a second? Okay. So one thing we need to talk about with the editions, the covers. Look, I'm not going to say that these covers aren't for anyone. I think
Right.
that some people really like these designs, but I don't think that they have that sort of classic look that would appeal to a lot of people uh, who are looking for something a bit more traditional. That
Okay.
you have to have at least one really easy
Black.
to obtain black
Black.
one. You're right.
Make sure you have a black Bible.
Right.
Good point. You got to make sure that some of the, like, I mean, again, early HCSB, they made sure you had the black leather edition.
Then you can put out the
Agreed.
one with the yellow cover and the
Yes, that's true. So I'm looking at it here, and it's actually hard to tell for sure whether it's line matched, but I'm going to say no. It doesn't look like it's line matched. Even in the poetry, I can see. Now, I can't really show it on camera. It's not showing up well. If it were line matched, then it wasn't done very well. So I do think that's something they need to make sure they do. That's just one example of a kind of a best practice in printing now.
yeah.
And I
feel
realize...
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, I feel like a big issue with the first edition of the MEV in terms of layout and things like that is that it feels like they're going by the excellent standards of the 1990s when
Right.
when you'd buy a Bible and be like, well, it was like a very low church view of it, like it shouldn't look fancy, it shouldn't look impressive because we have to be humble and our Bibles have to look like they're not meant to be showy and bringing attention to themselves. Right. Now, of course, you can swing far too much in the other direction. It just becomes all about showing off the nicest premium Bible you have. But surely there's a happy medium between looking very shoddy and looking, very gaudy. There's somewhere in between there.
Yeah. But the point I'm really making is just, to have a reference Bible, I think is a very important thing, which they're probably thinking that. And I'm just saying, make sure it's formatted as ideally as possible. That's going to be important. Another one is something that's portable. I think that's another really useful thing. And I would encourage, if I were the publisher, I'd be looking at these other publishers. I'd be getting copies. And like, look, okay, what's out there? I'd be watching reviews and reading reviews as to what people are saying. What's the hype about? Like, what are people saying? Oh, this is really good. And taking the things that you can apply. I realize it can be expensive, so you can't apply everything, but you could apply certain things.
Right, and I definitely think that they need to talk to you because I know you sort of obsessively have your favorite size of a Bible that you've talked about before.
Yes,
you consider to be
right.
the exact right size that a Bible should be, right? Yeah. We need to make sure we have those. We need to make sure, as some of the comments are saying, that we have single column editions.
That's right.
We need to have editions that are verse by verse for people who prefer that. We need choice. We need variety.
Mm-hmm. Now, someone actually is saying that their edition is line matched. So it's possible that some of them were. It's possible that the one I'm looking at is technically line matched and it just isn't done perfectly. But from that edition, that's the large print personal size. To me, it didn't seem like that line matching was evident. But there may be editions out there already, so I would make sure that that's done. And here's another suggestion. Look to Korea now for printing. I know that one of the things people give feedback about is they just don't favor China printings for various reasons, and I think we can guess some of them. Yeah. So maybe look at Korea. I know that's what a lot of publishers are starting to do.
Well, I think the general strategy is look to every single nitpick people have about Thomas Nelson and the New King James and just use that as a checklist.
That's right. That's a good idea.
For everyone who wants to argue about the small little things that they have with the New King James. No, the MEV doesn't do that. Trust us,
Yeah. All right. I have already heard people talking about the MEV verse. My brother actually chimed in the comments. He wants us to talk about the advantage of the MEV over the NKJV. We'll get to that. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We will get to that. But someone else also mentioned if the MEV discourages an update to the NKJV, I'll be a happy man, which doesn't surprise me to hear someone say that.
Right. Yeah. So this is actually something I mentioned to you the other day,
Yeah.
at which, we invite all of the people watching live to pretend they were there for that conversation as we keep making reference to it.
Yes.
But, one of the great advantages the MEV has is that it's fairly new. And so it's still flexible enough, and it hasn't been as universally adopted as the New King James. So if minor changes are made at this point, it won't be a big deal. Also, the editor is still alive and participating in it. The New King James, it came out in 82. Some minor tweaks were made in 84, but it really was this one-time project where a bunch of people came together, led by Art Farstad. They made it. They put out their book talking about how they did it, and that was kind of like the end. And that translation, I think, will work best if it's allowed to just continue existing as it is, and be this translation from the late 70s, early 80s that reflects what a translation from the late 70s, early 80s is. Because Art Farstad is no longer with us, I feel like it's best to just leave it alone. And because it's not even like the New American Standard Bible, because when I think of the New American Standard Bible, I think of the Lockman Foundation, not necessarily any of the particular translators involved with it. Whereas when I think of the New King James Version, I think Art Farstad, and I feel like it should be left alone. And so I would not suggest that Thomas Nelson should touch the New King James until the Mickey Mouse copyright laws force them to, in
Right.
2485 when Mickey Mouse finally gets into the public domain. Yeah. Until that time, leave the New King James alone. Let it become old and archaic and nearly impossible to read, just like the King James, right? Let it become the thing that people are complaining about, that we can't read this anymore, and let the MEV fulfill that role of being a modern English version, right? The New King James, it's evoking that tradition, whereas the title Modern English Version kind of invites itself for updates.
Yeah.
And so it can be the one that makes updates when necessary, when the English language changes, whereas the New King James can allow to become antiquated.
Well, getting back to the publishing advice and everything, I did see a comment here. I'd be interested in an index of scenarios where the MEV departs from the KJV with reasons why. I don't know that exists, but one thing I could say that is a possibility for an edition is a parallel Bible, where you have the King James on one column, the MEV in the next column. That would give you the opportunity to compare the two together, and for the MEV to, if someone edited this, they could actually explain maybe the reasons for the differences. But a
They
parallel
do have
Bible is
edition.
another.
Yeah, they do have parallel Bibles of the King James and the Modern English Version,
They
but there
do.
is no commentary. There is no set of net Bible notes at the bottom to explain why they made changes. I do know
Okay.
that some of the minor changes are probably the changes are probably most drastic in the Old Testament, where, for instance, they decide to follow one reading from the Masoretic text instead of another. If you know enough about the Hebrew text, you know that sometimes there will be a reading in the text and there will be an alternative reading, the reading that's supposed to be read aloud. And in a few places, the MEV decide to go with that text rather than the main text, which is something that is considered to be perfectly acceptable, because they're both the Masoretic text. It's not bringing in the Dead Sea
Right.
Scrolls or the Septuagint.
Right.
This is a tradition within Judaism of having alternative
Right.
readings that are meant to be read aloud.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think the reasons would be anything, but I can understand the desire to kind of especially if you're really used to the King James and you trust it. A lot of people want to understand why. So I understand, the what's being said there. Another comment just came here from my brother. Hey, Alan. I assume the MEV was translated without referring to the King James the way the NKJV does. Does anyone know if that's correct? I actually thought, and I'm not sure if you're asking this in this way, Alan, but my understanding is that the modern English version is exactly like the New King James in that it started with the King James as its base text,
Yeah.
right? So they're both actually very similar in that way. Now, when he says was translated without referring to the King James, I'm really not sure what he meant by that. But actually, yeah, the modern English version is like the New King James. It uses the King James as the base text, kind of assuming that's a good translation to start with, but then certainly willing to modify it.
Yeah, from what I understand, it started off as a group of army chaplains wanting to have a modern English equivalent to the King James because people weren't getting it. That's usually what leads to these updates of the King James, is that they realize that no one's understanding everything that they're reading, but that securing the rights to the New King James just wasn't realistic, and so they went about doing it themselves. Again, basing their work off of the King James and off of the exact same edition of the Hebrew Bible that was used by the King James translators, and basing it off of Scrivener's reconstructed Textus Receptus, which sort of start off with Stephanus and Beza and try to reconcile the decisions the translators made back in the 1600s. And so they worked from there. In a few places, people have tried to accuse it of breaking away from that tradition, but in most of the cases, it just seems to be that they chose to word it a bit differently.
Yeah, and my brother did clarify that he was asking about the base text. So, and that's good for people to know. The MEV is very much consciously trying to be in the heritage of the King James version, like the New King James. Although there's some differences there, and we'll talk about that. We'll revisit that as we go along here. Someone also asked if I'd be able to have the editor of the MEV to come on the channel and do an interview. I mean, I was willing to do this conversation, so I'm happy to talk about Bible translation with with the editor. I don't know. He may. I'm not sure what kind of how he feels at this point. I know early on when he was trying to help get it off the ground, he was willing to spend time doing PR for it. I'm not sure how he feels. I do want to actually mention though, because in interacting with him, I learned something about the second edition that I'm almost scared to say because I actually don't think people are all going to be in favor of this. But from what I understand, one of the changes has to do with italicized supplied words. Now, I need this before I say it. I need to remind people that at least the editions I've looked at, the italicized words were only in the Old Testament. For whatever reason, italicized words were not in the New Testament for the MEV, and I don't know if that was an oversight or what the reasons for that was. But when I asked the editor about it, he said in the next edition there will not be italicized words.
Okay, so yeah, this is what I've heard as well. And what I've noticed about the italicized words in the MEV is the MEV was far less willing to use italicized words unless what was being added was interpretive. I kind of feel like the New King James goes overboard with italics. It will mark words that are impossible to leave out if you're going to bring it into English, as opposed to just focusing on the words that need to be marked. That
Right.
you need to know that this isn't representing exactly what the Hebrew or Greek says. They will mark it. They will mark an is where you cannot bring into English without an is. And it's like you're telling me nothing relevant here. If you try to read the text without
Yeah,
that is
could
in
be
it, it's
it
gibberish.
could be misleading because it could imply that is not part of how the reader would have understood it, when in reality, in their way of communicating, you have to put is in there in order to correctly understand what that original reader was reading.
Right. And actually, when the New Testament of the New King James Version first came out in the late 70s, I think 78, they didn't have italicized words in the New Testament. And I think there was a bit of a fuss. And so they put them in there, and they really, really put them in there. And I see that one person, Nick Powers, made a comment about maximum transparency. I think at a certain point, the transparency becomes only useful if you're learning Hebrew and Greek, and stops being useful in any other way. Just to figure out, oh, wait a second, I need to put another word in here for it to make sense. Whereas
Yeah,
there are places where that transparency is absolutely necessary. I think of like earlier editions of the New American Standard Bible in 1 Corinthians 7, trying to interpret what it means to keep your virgin. If it means your daughter or your
yeah.
fiance, that the person you're betrothed to, it's a big deal to say, by the way, we're guessing at what virgin means here.
Yeah, I actually think that's probably what this person is trying to say, because there are lots of things that are not, they're not translated literally, and that's fine. But I know King James users tend to be the kind of people that they want to know, because if you're reading the ESV, I think the ESV is great, and it says it's an essentially literal translation. However, I would say it's not as literal as the New American Standard in certain cases, at least in certain cases, and not as literal as the New King James. And if there were italicized words, I think the people that are, again, it's the way that they think, it's the way that they're wired. They want to know. They want to know if a translator is in any way shaping this, or is this literal. So I think that's where that person's probably coming from.
Yeah. We better let Tim Nichols know. He just jumped in and kind of missed the context of that. We were giving examples of italicized words, and I mentioned 1 Corinthians 7.
That's great. Yeah, I need to make that one little part of our conversation a YouTube short, because that'll really draw people in. They'll be like, what are they talking about?
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
Okay, where I'm going with this is, I'm not disagreeing with you. I actually understand, and I'm okay with that decision if they take out italics altogether. I think for their user base, though, if I were the publisher, and this is unlikely to ever happen, but I would do what the Holman Christian
yes.
Standard did. I'd put in lower corner brackets, and I would do it sparingly, like you said, only when it's clearly like an addition that is not implied very directly by the original language. I mean, because then you can just be italicizing all over the place.
Right, and that is exactly what the Holman Christian Standard Bible did in that first edition. It was not just a sea of half brackets, which it would have to be if it were trying to be something you can back translate from. And so I think yes, I think that if they are having any second thoughts about putting in italics, don't do that. Rip off the Holman Christian Standard Bible and put in those half brackets, because they're not intrusive, but they do the job you need to do.
And I know these are hard decisions. I like I said, for me personally, I don't really have a strong feeling one way or the other. I just know that if the user base, I know this user base, the King James people have a lot of similarities with the NASB people too. And if you ever took the italics out of the NASB, it would be, it would be mayhem.
Right, yeah. I taught from the New American Standard Bible for years, and yeah, it's just not the New American Standard Bible without all of the ugly formatting you can put into a translation. It's part of its identity. It's like when people try to put out like nice looking editions of the New American Standard. I'm like, no, this is a workhorse. It needs to look utilitarian. That is the New American Standard. But the MEV,
I know it. I know what you're saying, but here I will put a plug in for the work that Klaus Krogh did for Zondervan on the NASB. The comfort print, NASB comfort print, looks fantastic, and it's still very utilitarian, as you say. But they actually, even with those small caps, designed them in a certain way on purpose to make sure they wouldn't look ugly. And it's really the best looking NASB typesetting, one of the best that's out there.
As long as they came up with a very nice looking set of asterisks for any time that Mark switches into the historical present, that's what's important to me.
That's right. Well, what they did is they based the New American on Aramaic limestone carvings.
Right.
Because it harks back to the original time of when those languages were being used, and so New American is trying very much to reflect the original languages in a very literal way. So that's why they designed it that way.
It's very much in the spirit of the original American Standard Version, which was, sort of condemned to the seminaries and was never, really used much behind the pulpit, because its whole purpose was to be something for, study. Right?
Oh, I like this, Alan.
Yes.
NASB's new motto, accurate but not pretty. Again, I actually think that the newer editions, not only Zondervan, but even Lockman has some now that they've improved. And now there are even editions being put out by evangelicalbible.com that look quite nice. But I hear you. I know what you're all saying. And that is one of the problems of italics. If you're used to it, you can get used to it. But it doesn't look great. Even I will say this, when I post verses in church, I think that's when the italics to me become more of a problem in a way, because I'm imagining someone who's showing up at church and they're reading it and they're looking at that going, why are some words emphasized? And in reality, they're not emphasized. They're supplied words. They're supposed to be de-emphasized, really.
Right. Well, I think that's just your calling to add the corner brackets yourself.
That's good. That's a good idea.
Yeah,
I can set the trend.
But I also think that the corner brackets, it's important to use corner brackets. I know the New American Bible Revised Edition, the Catholic translation, uses entire brackets, and it is also just very intrusive and distracting. So don't do that either. You just end up looking like the Amplified Bible.
And I see a user here saying, if I want italics, I'll use the NKJV and NASB. I feel like the MEV is a bridge between the ESV and NKJV. And I actually have to admit something. People that are using the MEV are already used to the New Testament not having italics. So I don't think it's a deal breaker for most of them. I'm just thinking about trying to draw in the King James user base and what most likely is going to help sell them on it. And being Textus Receptus is a big one. But having something to indicate supplied words, in my mind, might be helpful too. The other thing I might say about this is it doesn't have to be in every edition. You could have, certain editions that are, just kind of a special edition where you do have the bracketed corner bracket words for those who really feel it's necessary. But most of your editions could have no indications. All right. So I think we've said kind of the main things we want to say about being if we were their publisher. I sympathize. I'm sure the decisions they have to make, they're dealing with real money, and if you're going to put money out there, it's an investment. And already they printed the first edition, and as you said, didn't necessarily sell all of them. So I can understand why it's challenging to create a second edition. I don't think you have to print a lot, though. You could strike a deal, I'm sure, with even like evangelicalbible.com. Like they do all kinds of special editions. So, I mean, there's a lot of potential out there in today's market for just doing small runs.
Right. And I think considering all the possibilities you have with small runs might be useful as well. One
Yeah.
of the big places where I think the MEV could do something interesting if the translation committee and the publishers would get on board with it would be to try to incorporate an apocrypha at a certain point. Um, if you want to use the apocrypha in the New King James, you're kind of stuck with the Orthodox Study Bible. And that's great if you're Orthodox. But if you are, say, Anglican, and you want to use the Apocrypha as part of your, daily readings, for instance, if I'm wanting to follow the reading plan in the original King James, and I get to, well, we're in November, and it's telling me that I need to be reading Wisdom of Solomon and Ecclesiasticus, the New King James isn't going to help me out there.
Yeah.
And so having editions with the Apocrypha, ones that are specifically targeted toward Anglicans, Catholics, Orthodox, who would want to have that
Yeah.
included, I think that would be a smart thing because one of the
Yeah.
big problems that Charisma House can run into is just targeting charismatics. And I think one of the big issues that the first edition had is it kind of was thought to be a charismatic Bible in the same way that the Holman Christian Center was thought to be a Southern Baptist Bible. And if the second edition can sort of break that the way that the CSB did, where people stop just thinking about this as the Southern Baptist translation, in this case, stop thinking about it as the charismatic translation, I think that would be really helpful.
I think the way they could do it too, because it reminds me a little bit of Crossway. Crossway is essentially, has ties to a more reformed part of Christianity, but they've been very wise about maintaining their own printing identity. When it's a Crossway Bible, you know what it is, but there's a Catholic edition of the ESV, and there are other groups that I think have used the I'm thinking of like the Gideons have gotten the ESV printed with the Textus Receptus in the New Testament. Some of those readings.
Yes,
So what you
some of the
can do,
readings, not most of them. They
but
are
what you
very,
can,
very weird and picky on what they picked up put in that ESV.
yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of particular, but what I'm getting at is the Charisma House doesn't have to print these editions. They just have to license it
Right.
to other publishers who want to print, because there is the Greek Orthodox I'm sure there's some publisher out there that would love to be able to take the MEV and adapt it to their particular setting, their tradition.
Right.
So,
Yeah. From what I know, the Eastern Orthodox churches that primarily speak English tend to use the King James and sometimes the New King James because the New Testament basis is closer to the Byzantine
that's right.
text that they have passed down for generations.
Right.
And it sounds traditional, and they like things to sound
Yes.
traditional.
Yes. So the modern English version really fits that in many ways. So I think it's a good time now to kind of steer into that second topic, which is how is the modern English version different from the King James version in its English, and are there, would you say, improvements, and in what way would you say it's different and maybe even better than the King James for the typical reader today?
Okay, so what makes it better for the reader today is that it's far less common for you to run across a word in the modern English version that is not representing the word's usage in modern English. I mean, I could say it's right there in the title, but far fewer times will you find that you read a word and you assume it means one thing, and it actually means something completely different because 400 years of semantic drift have changed what that passage means. Of course, like the New King James and like the New American Standard Bible and like the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version and the English Standard Version, there are cases where you will find some word in there that they are keeping because that's what the King James says and you don't touch it. It's very hard to pry people away from the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, even though want is being used in that particular verse in a way that most people don't use it today. There's always going to be those words, but generally speaking, it's going to far less often mislead you in a way that the translators of the King James or William Tyndale and Miles Coverdale before them never intended to mislead you. It wasn't misleading when they did the translations back in the 1500s and early 1600s. It's just that it happens that by now the words have shifted meaning to the point that you read it and you think you understand what it means, and it means the exact opposite.
Yeah. I noticed a comment just that came up here. The MEV has been a pleasant surprise to me. I find it preserves the subtler aspects of the KJV, and I do want to really encourage King James users to get a copy of the Modern English Version. I just heard someone the other day who uses the King James all the time, but he was trying to get a Bible for a relative, and the person told him, like, I can't understand the King James, and so he was willing to get a different translation for his relative. But for those of you who use the King James, the Modern English Version really, again, it uses the King James as the base text. And so what you're talking about, Marcus, is the fact that it's modern English. It doesn't have what Mark Ward refers to as false friends,
right?
Which are, I think the way he puts it is, they're words that you don't know that you don't know, something like that. In other words, you think you know it because it sounds like a word you use, but it has a different meaning now. So you don't realize you're misunderstanding the word.
Right. And some of these changes can be fascinating because it may simply be that differences in pronunciation have led to changes and things like that. One of my favorites is in 1 Samuel when the Philistine leader asks David if he's whether he made a road today. And if you try to figure out what in the world that means, it's not that David went into infrastructure and with the Philistines, but rather that by the mid 1800s, they realized that it would be valuable to distinguish one meaning of road from another. And they had the word inroad, and we kind of still use inroad, although we almost never use it literally anymore. But they realized, hey, the Scottish pronounce the word road in a really weird way. They pronounce it raid. What if we just start using the Scottish pronunciation and use spelling based on that? And so this meaning of road can now be pronounced and spelled raid, and we can now know the difference. And the one downside of that is that now you can't see constant YouTube ads for Road to Shadow Legends, but but other than that, it's fine.
Oh man, I know this word is not a false friend, but the one that really strikes me, when I was growing up, I went to a Christian school even in kindergarten, and we learned the ABCs with verses that went with each letter of the alphabet. And when we got to Q, I believe the verse was, quit ye like men. And I love that expression because quit we never use to mean what they meant back then, which the better, like the closer you could get to it would be like to acquit yourself in this way. Right? But to actually use the word quit today means give up.
Right. So yeah, exactly. If you want to update that while still keeping the flavor of the original, you do say acquit yourselves like men. But if you really want to use that verse today, you would use it like on your 2 weeks notice, right?
That's right.
Don't go in and like send an email or something. Walk in there like a man and tell them.
That's right. Quit you like man. Bible Gateway, I remember, has like the I think it's I can't remember if it's Wycliffe translation. I think it's Wycliffe. It says "Do ye manly" for that verse. I love that. That's a great rendering right there. Do ye manly. All right. Well,
Yes, Tim Nichols, by the way, is asking about the updated corrective MEV. I
yeah.
can say yes. Uh, they have essentially completed it, and the only reason I say is essentially completed it is because the publisher keeps delaying the release, and so the more the release is delayed, the more the editor sits around and says, "Well, anyone else have any suggestions?" But since we clearly have time to kill, I mean that's kind of what's
Yeah.
been happening. But
You know, I would at this point inquire if I were involved in the project about licensing it, because I think that might. I'm not saying that they're going to be able to do that before the second edition. I mean, I think the publisher, they need to put it out there first. They're the ones who have the rights. But I think because of how long it's taken to get this edition, and realizing that that publisher may feel like it's just not cost effective for whatever reason, looking into other companies out there that might want to publish it, add it to their portfolio. I'll give you an example. Nelson had the King James and the New King James. They could print that. They needed a modern version, and so they got the NET.
yes, the NET.
And they added it to their portfolio because it complemented the other Bibles they were selling. So there may be a publisher out there who's like, we have this old version, or we have this particular version with these character traits. We need something that will contrast it, that we could also sell.
Well, yeah, one that I would immediately think of would be something like Tyndale. Tyndale has the New Living Translation, and that's excellent for what it is targeting itself as being. Right? It's a very much on the dynamic equivalence side of the scale. So if they had a translation
Yes.
that was leaning more in formal equivalence, but wasn't the King James, that might be very advantageous to them.
That's a great example, because the Tyndale publishes the NLT, which is way over here on the Thought for Thought side, and they actually published the King James. So to have the MEV would be like, perfect. It would round out their portfolio of what they're making available. That's such a great idea.
Right.
So Tyndale, would you also talk to the publisher, Charisma House, and work out something?
Yeah.
We'll what is it called?
Just, sort of lay some more money on the table, just anyone else listening, right?
That's right.
But yeah,
I'm trying to think of the Bible app. I can't believe when I'm doing these live streams how I cannot remember the name of the Bible app that Tyndale does. Because the only name that comes to my head when I say Bible app is Logos, and that is not it. It's the they have a really good Bible app. I can't think of it. Somebody in the comments will probably remind me what it's called. But Tyndale, with their Bibles, has this app that you can use, and it gives you study materials. So you could have the NLT with that app, the King James with that app, and the MEV with that app. Man, my brain is just shot. I cannot think of it. All right, so I think we've covered like the first two things. Yes, thank you. I needed that. It was the Filament app.
Okay, so that's what you're talking about. I wasn't even associating that. Like I just associate that with scanning the codes and things like that. So I wasn't thinking of it independently. I was trying to think of something more like.
You know why I can't think of it? Because it reminds me. I can't remember people's names, because to me, most people's names are random. There's no reason why that person I'm looking at should be called Jennifer. It just seems like the two things in my brain don't go together. There's no reason. It's just like randomly and Filament. I'm sorry to say it, but I don't understand why it's called Filament. So to me, it's like trying to come up with some random name for this app. So anyway, that shows you how my brain works or how it doesn't work.
Maybe their goal was the exact opposite. They wanted to pick a word that would just stand out in your mind so much and be like, why did they pick that word that, it would stay with you?
Yeah. Well, Nicholsworth said Nelson. I also think Nelson couldn't pick up the MEV because they already have the NET. And I know that they're different, but I don't think they're different enough. I think that Tyndale is just the exact right example of the kind of publisher that really has a gap in that middle translation philosophy, the mediating translation philosophy.
Yeah, I think if Nelson were trying to obtain the MEV, it would probably be just to kill it, right? Because it's competition.
Yeah, that it would be competing with the NKJV, which leads us to our other topic.
I was setting up that segue.
Good job. And I just saw another comment, so we can just see what this says. The MEV was also published by or maybe Hendrickson Publishers.
Yes, Hendrickson put it out in the Fire Bible, and they actually went in and made some of the corrections that people were asking for. The MEV first edition had those typos that everyone kind of knew about, and the Fire Bible tried to fix those, but it wasn't a proper second edition. It was just an edition with some minor corrections.
Oh, and I'm glad they brought that up, because Hendrickson is another publisher that would be, again, they could license it out for other editions.
Yeah, and I like Hendricks. Actually, Hendrickson, isn't it now owned by Tyndale?
Oh, maybe it is.
Yeah, and so if they want to use the Hendrickson label, have at it. I know that Hendrickson is how they're putting out the new Revised Standard Version Update Edition and all those wonderfully cheap editions they're putting out.
Oh, really? I didn't even know about that. Okay. All right. Well, once again, there's some comments going on about the King James and Nicholsworth. I know you feel strongly about this. The NKJV should not be updated. If you're headed there, blocked. I think he's joking around, but he does feel strongly about that.
Right, and the problem is that Tim Nichols came in when we were talking about virgins in 1 Corinthians 7 and missed when we said earlier that one of the advantages that the MEV has is that it's more appropriate to update it since the head translator or the editor is still with us, and it doesn't feel as icky to update it.
Oh, and he actually confirmed that Hendrickson is owned by Tyndale. We found the answer. Tyndale or Hendrickson can be the co-publisher for the MEV. I think that would be a great opportunity. It really would.
Yeah. Emendations has commented that Tim Wildsmith is blocked. Understandable. So, unfortunately.
Wildsmith was the one who was trying to...
Right. So, our target audience, Charisma House, who are you trying to sell the MEV to? It's Tim Wildsmith, the man who desperately needs the New King James to be updated. He is your target audience.
Which means you can't put it in a bright colored Bible.
Right.
You can't do a Thompson Chain Reference edition. I'm trying to think what else Tim Wildsmith doesn't like.
Yeah, he put out a video just listing...
things he doesn't like. All right, so the MEV versus the NKJV, I think people have already set this up really well. That would be one of the advantages of the MEV, is that you can update it more easily without people having a problem, because the NKJV is very solidified. You talked about this before. It's very solidified, and you said also that it's tied in closely with Art Farstad, who helped lead the project for the NKJV. I would also argue that the New King James Version is consciously trying to be an update of the King James Version, and it took a long time for the King James Version to even be updated to the extent that the NKJV did. It just seems too early for the approach that the NKJV is really taking. it just seems too early. So I really agree with you on that. And I think the MEV is different. It's trying to be consciously a modern English version. So it has to be up to date.
Right. Yeah, I think before it gets a proper revision, the New King James is going to have to go through its Paris and Blaney edition where they update the spelling. You know,
There you go.
that's
There you
what
go.
needs to happen first.
And the Noah Webster edition,
Yes.
like the King James. Yeah. The modern English version, though, even if it does get updated, and I know every translation goes through an initial update. The second edition is going to be that. Even the New King James Version had an initial tweak. That's very common. But what we're talking about is an extensive update. And the modern English version, and this is more of a question for you, how often would you say it should be updated? Like compare it to the English Standard Version or the New American Standard,
Okay.
right?
So my opinion about the English Standard Version is that it should have only been updated once. I think that they kind of got overboard on that.
Okay.
It's also kind of an issue that the New Living Translation has run into, where they put out their big update in 2004, but then they just kept messing with it and messing with it and messing with it. And the 2015 edition isn't drastically different from the 2004. You can use them beside each other, but the more you just start fussing with it, the more people lose confidence in it. So I would say,
It's such a catch-22, Marcus, because here's what I've observed. The New American Standard doesn't update too often, but when they update, it is always a big deal. You could even make the case that when they did the 95, which now most people say they love the 95, but there are still people to this day that say they only use the 77 NASB. Because when you don't update, people get more and more attached to it. The New King James is actually a really good example of that. And I think they did the right thing by not updating it. But now people are so attached to the New King James. So my thought is they need to find a balance if they're going to do updates, that if they wait too long, then people really flip out when you do update it.
Right. I would say that at least wait a decade. It's been a decade since the first edition of the MEV came out.
Yeah.
And even this isn't going to be some drastic overhaul.
Yes.
When I think of, the American Standard Version to the Revised Standard Version, that was about 50 years. And then from the first edition of the Revised Standard Version until the new Revised Standard Version, that was from 52 to 89. Or if you want to go by the English Standard Version, it's again another 50 years. I think that's the point where you have to do it if you're concerned about doing an upkeep,
Right. I agree. I think the NASB probably has had more of that idea behind it, that it's updated when it started to feel outdated. The ESV, in my opinion, has taken a better approach. I admit that it probably updated too often, perhaps, but by doing these small incremental changes, people have adjusted to them better overall, because they don't feel like their whole translation is being overhauled. They just feel like it's being tweaked at times. Now, I do think the ESV, like you said, probably went overboard. But if you waited 10 years and just tweaked it, waited another 10 years and tweaked it, to me, you're not even calling it a different translation. You're not saying it's the updated edition. You're just saying, no, we're making sure that it, nothing major. We're not going to do any major changes. We're just going to make sure if something isn't quite in place anymore, maybe the term just doesn't quite fit the way it did 20 years ago. Those 10-year updates would allow you to do that.
Well, yeah. So I think about how Bruce Metzger, the editor, the head editor of the New Revised Standard Version, talked about how we realized, when the Revised Standard Version said, I will accept no bull in my house, so that had completely changed by the time we got to 1989. But then I've used the New Revised Standard Version in teaching this, teaching high school, and we get to some of the prophetic books, and it's talking about people taking booty, and you have to explain that that means like the spoils of war, and the updated edition has changed that because they've realized it since 1989
Yeah.
when people see that term talking about,
Yeah.
they do not associate it with the spoils of war anymore. They associate it with body parts.
Yeah. Yeah. And someone agreed with me and said they they think that the ESV's update process was good because it doesn't split the audience. And that's actually for conservatives especially, because we're actually talking a lot in this video about conservative translations. Conservative translations are used by conservative people. Conservative people don't like change. So if you're going to change, you have to be very strategic about it. And
Right.
and what I've noticed, I'm just going by what has actually happened. In theory, conservatives will always tell you never change it. But in practice, if you do what the ESV did and you just tweak it before people get too attached, usually that's okay. The one thing the ESV did, though, was they changed a couple passages, especially at the beginning of the Bible. It had to do with
Genesis
your
3:16.
yeah, your
Okay,
desire.
yes.
Yes.
So here's the thing. The 2007 edition of the
Yeah.
ESV made very minor changes, and I can only think of one that might get people upset, and it's
Yeah.
also in Genesis, where they translated a past tense verb as a past perfect following the NIV, and I could see someone griping about that. But the 2011 edition, the biggest change it made was in First Samuel, when it finally decided to make sense of that verse where it's trying to provide the ruling years of King Saul, and it's believed that the numbers have been dropped from the Hebrew text. But it was the 2016 edition where they follow the scholarship of Susan Foe from the 1970s. She put out a paper talking about the desire in Genesis, and Susan Foe was had a reputation of being an anti-feminist scholar. And
Okay.
her decision on how to interpret that was highly controversial. And initially, the only place where you saw a translation even referencing that was in the footnotes of the New Living Translation. But then when the ESV came out in 2001, they offered it as an alternative reading in the footnotes. And then the Net Bible actually put it in the main text, and then had, of course, a 5,000 word essay explaining why they did that. The New Living Translation in the 2004 edition followed suit. And then after multiple opportunities to do so and not doing it, finally, when the ESV decided to put out their permanent text in 2016, they threw it down and said, okay, we're changing this finally. And that's part of what caused the controversy. It's not just that they translated in a way that seemed to be anti-feminist or anti-egalitarian, but that they did it and they said, and we're done. It came on the heels of some of the ESV translators already being criticized throughout the 2000s for being overly harsh on the TNIV, and kind of getting a reputation for being like complementarian bulldogs. And for them to do that in their last edition and say, and here's our final word on it, it felt like sort of a complementarian mic drop that upset a lot of people.
Well, if you know the history of the ESV, that's basically, that's its roots, is very tied in with complementarian theologians. But I hear what you're saying. That was a very overt way of handling it. Let me put up Tim Nichols again. Thank you, Tim Nichols, for chiming in a lot. And please check out his channel. I'm sure everybody here already knows about it, but just in case, if you're not aware, Nicholsworth Bible Reviews. He says, here's his take. The Bible is ancient. While understanding it is important, constantly updating it, in my mind, comes with more risks than leaving it alone. That right there encapsulates a conservative's mindset. The conservatives really are hesitant. But here's my other side of the coin way of talking about this. You mentioned, Marcus, that if you change things, that you people maybe don't trust it as much because you're changing it. That to me is how conservative people think. There are another group of people out there that I've observed that when you make changes, their thinking is now we have the most up to date scholarship that has been incorporated into what we now read in this updated edition. Therefore, it's more trustworthy because it is the most recent scholarly update.
Right. But keep in mind, even then, how long does that take? The Revised Standard Version got its second edition in 1971, nearly 20 years after the first edition. And then the new Revised Standard Version came out almost 20 years after that. And then from 1989 until 2021, we didn't have any more updates until the updated edition of December 2021. And so, like, yeah, they want to be as up to date as possible, but those translations are taking a few decades each time to
It's
let
true.
enough things happen, both in the language and in the scholarship. It's not
It's true.
every 2 to 3 years.
I agree. I think on the level of true logic, if we're just, the most ideal way to approach it academically would be to wait enough time so you can even evaluate what the real issues are, what's worth holding on to and what's worth letting go of. But on the ground level, what I'm saying is with conservative people, you have to be very careful about waiting.
Well, right. I mean, I think even about the New American Standard, uh, rationally, the 2020 edition is what should have come out in 95 because it was reflecting the language changes of the time. If you were only concerned with following style guides of the 1990s, if you open up style guides
Right.
for writing in the 1990s,
Yeah.
the 2020 edition is what it should have been.
Right.
But because they were concerned with appealing to conservatives, they did not just follow the lead of the new Revised Standard Version and stick in "ancestors" in italics. The scandalous thing that the 2020 edition has done, putting in italic words to say the word here might also imply this.
Now, Tim Nichols, I don't know if you were asking what I called you. Maybe did I call you conservative by saying that? So I don't know if that is what you're asking there. But here's my answer or my view. I appreciate what Nichols is saying. Here's how I would go about it. And it's the same thing I always say. You should have a translation like the New King James that stays the same for a very long time. And you can always go back to it and say, it hasn't changed. It is what it was. I'm all for that. You should have another translation that is willing to change. Not to change what the Bible says. No, nobody's saying it. But to make sure that it's up to date in the way it conveys English and also up to date in its scholarship. Those are my thoughts. It's just like I like to have two translations.
And I mean, if we want to talk about conservative in relation to the modern English version, we have to remember not only is it using the Textus Receptus, but it does not have a critical apparatus in the New Testament that points out where it differs from the Nestle Aland text. Nor does it have extensive notes in the Old Testament that talks about where it disagrees with the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint. The New King James does that. And that's actually something I really like about it, that, you get the traditional text, but you also get references to where more modern scholarship disagrees with it. The MEV doesn't do that. It has hardly any textual notes. The only thing that I can think of that even marks is 1 John 5:7, which is one that
Yeah.
you kind of have to mark. Even Scribner's Cambridge Paragraph Bible from 1873 put that verse in italics to mark that. And people might fuss about marking a verse as unreliable, but I can open up the original 1611 King James and see in Luke 17:36 where it marks the verse as doubtful. And if you get any trends, like if you get the Tyndale's initial New Testament, Coverdale's Bible, or the Matthew Bible, you will not find Luke 1736 in there. It was first put in there in the Great Bible, and that's because the Great Bible was just inserting verses from the Vulgate left and right. It was putting it in parentheses and in smaller type, basically like what the New American Standard Bible used to do with the brackets for the verses that were disputed. At least from they didn't do that in the 71 or 73 editions, but they introduced that in the 75 edition and did it in the 77 and 95. And the LSB is still doing it now. Probably more information than your audience needs.
No, that's good. That's good.
Me just random details.
I think the point though that I hope people will at least hear my vantage point on this is that the New King James and the Modern English version actually can be very complementary to each other, because the New King James can provide you the stable text that especially conservative people really long for. Even in the comments I saw, we have shared language when you have a stable text. People can always refer to the same wording. So I get that. And you can update in the New King James eventually, if they wanted to, you could update the footnotes. That would be one way to do it. Some scholarly updating of the New King James is just update the footnotes. But regardless, if you keep the New King James text stable, the Modern English version can be a complement to that, because that doesn't have to be as stable. And I don't think either of us are saying that the Modern English version needs to be updated a lot. But
Tim Frisch,
the New King James version.
Tim Frisch is saying he wants the Modern English version updated every 2 years. And he also wants 1 Corinthians 6:9 to read, men who do things that we're going to describe with a euphemism so you won't know what we're talking about.
Yes, that's we already have a translation that does that.
And it's called the King James Version.
Oh, there you go.
It's also the New Revised Standard Updated Edition, but it's also
that's yeah, I guess. I don't know. The King James, it's kind of a head scratcher when you read it in the King James, but anyway, ultimately Nichols agrees with me. So that's a great. I feel like we're coming to a wonderful conclusion to this conversation. He says, leave the NKJV alone and let the MEV be its modern cool cousin.
Right, and also the MEV is ever so slightly less literal than the New King James, or I'd say even just a little less literal than the ESV. It's sort of like between the ESV and the New Revised Standard. And so that allows it to be less awkward in some places. And so I'd say, when I think of translations, I kind of think of three categories. I think of the ones that are trying to be very, very literal, and oftentimes very high register as well, with less concern over being easily readable. Then I think of the ones in the middle, which I think of as the Sunday school translations, where they don't have to be beautiful. They don't have to be, majestic. They just have to be very clear and straightforward, while still being literal enough that you can point out important details. And so I think about the CSB or the NIV or the NET. And then you have the ones that are far more idiomatic, the New Living Translation, the Good News Bible, Common English Bible over here. And so I think the MEV is kind of in a place where it can be both the traditional pulpit Bible, where we want it to sound ultra traditional, but it can also be a Sunday school translation where it's readable and accessible enough for that. And again, I'm thinking that could be another place that they could go for it. So Charisma House, as you make this lucrative licensing deal with Tyndale, you should consider that.
Yeah, I mean, we've really come out with some great solutions in this conversation. So hopefully someone from there will have something that's useful for them if they've listened to this. And I do see, kind of concurring with what you just said, the poetic books and the MEV, this person says, really shine for them. I'm guessing that it retains a little bit of a majestic, formal sound to it at times. And maybe that's why. Yeah,
it retains a lot of the majesty of the King James language without retaining some of the awkwardness. And I feel like the New King James kind of did both. It kind of retains some of the majesty and some of the awkwardness, whereas I feel like the MEV was trying to retain the majesty without the awkwardness.
Yeah, and that's always going to be a challenge as time goes on because language is changing. And I think the New King James in 1982 sounded really modern if you were used to the King James Version. But now we have so many modern translations that the New King James sounds pretty old, actually, in certain ways, right?
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, again, because it
Right.
can kind of fulfill that function of the original King James. It is the
Yes.
old, majestic, a little dusty, but a little, impressive at the same time, right? It makes you feel like you're truly hearing that. It plays into our psychology of old and
Mm-hmm.
just it's that Shakespearean feel, right? And so
Yeah.
it's kind of like how some novels from like the early 20th century are starting to get that way as well,
Hmm.
where you read them and they seem to have this high lofty language to them when if you would have read them in like the 30s, it wouldn't have necessarily been that impressive to you. But now it's like, wow, this really feels lofty and important,
Yeah.
compared to the way we use language
Yeah.
now.
Yeah. That's definitely part of it. It's really interesting. And here's another compliment from the same person. There's a rhythm to the MEV that makes the ESV a bit chunky. Now, I'll be honest, I read the MEV some. I haven't read it a lot. And I didn't find it to be consistent, maybe is the word I'm looking for. Like, I think, and it's the ESV's that way too sometimes, where it's like sometimes the ESV, the English sounds very smooth and really perfect. And then other times it's like, oh, that is a little clunky. But I think that's what this person is saying, is that the MEV to them reads more consistently. And so I guess that's
Yeah.
what some people take away.
Yeah. Well, that always happens with updates anyway. I can show you
Mm.
verses from the RSV that I think read better than the ESV, or the NRSV verses from the
Mm.
NRSV that read better than the other two, and ones from the ESV
Yeah.
that read better than the other two.
Yeah, and we have to remember when all of us look at these Bibles as English speakers, we have so many options that are at our disposal. I went to Kenya. This is my
Yeah.
sweatshirt that I get.
Keep
You got
going.
to get going?
I need to do something for just a second, but keep going.
Yeah. So when I was in Kenya, and this is the sweatshirt is from Kenya, I actually noticed that the Bible translations that they had there were very limited. And there were only 2 Bible translations that they had available in Kenya. And yet here we are talking about, translation after translation in English. And I think ultimately the problem that we have in English is that we often are suffering from having too many translations. And that can cause us to almost fixate on every little difference and thing we like or don't like. And so now a lot of people are having paralysis where they can't even find a translation to land on because there's just too many choices. And so in some ways, when you go to another country, it's kind of refreshing because they don't worry about these things the way that English speakers worry about them. So
Right. Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, and I think that might have been an objection when the MEV first came out. It was like, well, why do we need this one too? But the
yeah,
thing is, it exists now, and so we might
yeah.
as well make it work the best we can and find the best niche for it we can, and then maybe tell other people, please don't put out another one. I think we got it covered. You know?
Not going to happen. We're always going to have one other translation that someone thinks is needed.
Oh yeah. Well, I just looked into it, and as we did this stream, 5 more translations have come out. So
Well, you can tell why they come out though, and I know it's tongue in cheek, but they come out all the time. Partly because we, as English speakers, have so much at our disposal, And we do often, as consumers in America, say, "Oh, if I could have this translation, but just with it a little different, if it could just have this, that would be my perfect translation." And so there's every kind of, we split it down to every kind of desire there is.
Yeah, it does run the problem of starting to look like Protestant denominational divides, where it's like,
Yeah, it's endless.
did we have to break over that one?
Yeah. And that's why at the end of the day, I tend to favor translations that have risen above that line and have really gathered a large following. I think that MEV has a place and it can serve certain people, but until it reaches a certain threshold, it's not going to be one that's my go-to. Just because I don't think enough people use it. And I know that sounds kind of a weird way to approach it, but I think there's a reason that certain translations do well. Yes, part of it is who is the publisher behind them. I admit that. But part of it is there's a reason why the NASB, as you said earlier, got relegated to the seminaries a lot. It just didn't click with a lot of the average readers out there, whereas the NIV did. So I think we have to take that into account. Anyway,
well, I mean, that's because our English language has gone into the Laodicean age, and that's why the NIV took over, right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, we can talk eschatology another time if you want, but I think this has been a really good conversation, and I do want to thank the audience for sticking with us. It's been a good audience, and a lot of people have been watching this, so we really do appreciate you chiming in and adding to the conversation. And I'm going to let the audience go, but thank you so much, everyone, for being with us tonight. We had a great time talking with you all. Have a good night.